Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third and final day. We are in Breakout Room 2 on financing and investment in research and development. It is my pleasure to introduce two of our breakout discussants we have so far. The first is Maria Elena Bottazzi. You've seen her in our very first panel. She is the Associate Dean of National School of Tropical Medicine for Baylor University. And we have Ran Balicer, the Chief Innovation Officer from Clalit. I see this is French, so I'm ruining it already. Health Services that will be taking over. I will first start with Maria to discuss financing and investments for research and development. Thank you, and take it away.
Wonderful. Thanks, Johanna. And Ran, it's a pleasure to have a conversation with you. I know we're waiting on our Phyllis Arthur, our moderator, but Johanna, thank you for joining us and guiding us in the conversation. So I think throughout this series of workshops, we are breaking out with regards to how do we discuss a little bit of the need of, certainly sustainable financing and investments. And from my side, I bring the perspective of an academic based vaccine center. So, as you can see from my backdrop, I'm at Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's. Alongside with Peter Hotes, we've been co-directing a vaccine center that primarily focuses on bringing new discoveries from the bench rapidly into the clinic for an array of neglected tropical diseases and emerging infectious diseases, of course, including coronavirus vaccines. And we have been very privileged to be working in the COVID-19 vaccine also. And I think if I may even start with, what are really the challenges as academic based and predicated on the fact that we work as product development partnerships, where you require, of course, to work with many partners, each of us with very specific capabilities and expertise, is how do you really garner the sufficient funds, not only to do each of the different sections of the vaccine development continuum, but how do you also sustain that to ensure that you end up enabling transitioning into critical path activities? And by that, also, it requires that you not only get R&D funding for the technical side and scientific operation of the activities, but also the entire backdrop of quality systems, regulatory enabling, program management. And so it's not just getting a grant to design a vaccine and understand its, production or its immunogenicity. Is how do you do it, enabling it to be able to become a actual product. And so that requires that we in an academic center also have to adapt the same business practices as any biotechnology or any pharmaceutical company, because you require very strict not only documentation trails, but certainly quality management systems that enable, of course, interacting with, technology transfer manufacturers, or certainly also the regulatory agencies. So I'll stop there. And so my contribution will primarily be in, that gap of that financing and investment of the early to mid-stage critical path activities.
Thank you, Maria, and it is a pleasure. And I think that everything that you mentioned is critical. And I would like to take a look at exactly the next phase of the development and testing scheme, which is the part that we really are focused on. I come from a health system, the largest healthcare system in Israel, that is approximately over 50% of the Israeli healthcare system, and we cover. It doesn't sound like much in global terms, but it's about 4.5 million people, which is about half the population, as well as 1/3 of the acute hospital beds. And what we try to do in this realm is really to focus on the real world studies and to understand how, when we get to the latest stages of the development testing, how to perform large scale real world assessment of the actual effectiveness after the efficacy trials are done. And how do you do the right adjustment of the right drug or the right vaccine for the right population and to do this on real world based data. And the challenges in doing that are quite immense. First of all, one aspect that I wanted to mention in terms of the funding is, since we have many different institutions, if you want to have them involved in each one of these efforts, and we've done some trials with CDC and with other entities, it requires to have the right level of specialty and staff in each one of them. And that cannot be rerun and recreated in each trial and in each effort separately. They need to maintain those on an ongoing basis. And that is a challenge, because sometimes there are serious gaps in time between some of these opportunities for actual trials. And this gap could, they cannot take those well-educated people on the front lines and, drop them for half a year until the next opportunity comes in. So you lose a lot of the expertise in this process, and it's very difficult to maintain a network of hospitals and community clinics that will be able to collaborate you when you actually need them in time. So there has to be a way in which we can sustain a nucleus of some expertise in all of these collaborating entities at once. And that is very difficult because there's definitely not in Israel, there isn't a mechanism to do that. And it's very hard to do this every time again and again. So this is one aspect that we can talk about. And the other one is when it comes to data-driven analyses on masses. And the ability to perform what is sometimes called phase 4 or big data-driven assessment, it all boils down to the quality of the data that you have. And improving the quality of the data requires, again, an ongoing investment, both on the clinical side in order to get the right type of diagnostics done and recorded and available in near real time if you want to have them analyzed, and to have a quality assurance, because otherwise it's basically garbage in, garbage out, unless you know what is the quality of the diagnostics that were performed in each case. And then there's the level of maintenance of the data sets when you want to take a look at the demographics and all the different covariates in order to do proper real-world studies. And if there's one thing that COVID-19 has taught us, is that these type of studies are a critical complement of the classic clinical trials, and they're critical in our understanding of both effectiveness, but also in terms of side effects and safety. And you can't have just one. You need to have them both. And there has to be a whole infrastructure to allow these types of data-driven studies. And later on today in this panel, I think we'll talk a little bit more about what it takes to perform a proper real-world data-driven retrospective data study.
I don't know, Johanna, if you want to take over, but you raised a very, very important point, Ran, because you of course have to have the right data to enable what you say, the real life exercises. But you really also need to understand where those real life exercises will happen for us to then go backwards and design the vaccines that we need. And maybe I know that the aspiration of this workshop is also seeing what have we really learned during this COVID-19 pandemic to then improve how we are handling not only the development of new potential influenza vaccine platforms, whether they're for seasonal or pandemic, influenza, but at the same time also see how do we bring in these new efficiencies or new innovation, and everything always ends up being by, I think we can do a very good job organizing ourselves scientifically, but again, we're going back to the fact that we really need sustainable financial and business models that we can really drive, right? And so we've seen that from the COVID-19 experience, having funding that is coordinated and organized through all the different pillars of agencies, right? So, I of course have the experience within the US and a little bit global, where you have NIH, BARDA, or you have, Wellcome Trust, or, Public Health England or whatever. And then you have, of course, CEPI. And those really enable different areas of where the continuum of development falls. But I feel that even within the funders, even though now we have a few initiatives where, all the funders also have to be able to work together and say, okay, I'm going to fund this piece. But once that piece is achieved, there has to be continuity that somebody else will pick it up. And I'll give you just one example. So we started developing coronavirus vaccines in 2011. We, of course, competed to an NIH grant with a consortium of partners. We got the funding, actually quite nice, substantial funding, to bring, again, a discovery platform, which was a conventional receptor binding domain vaccine using yeast expression systems, to fashion it into an actual product, meaning tech transfer. We actually were very successful with tech transfer to Walter Reed Army Institute of Research in their pilot manufacturing facility. We had pretty much all the data information that would enable an IND application, a regulatory application. And we finished our grant saying we reached our milestones. Where do we go next, right? The next is, let's get money to do the actual regulatory submission, the toxicology study, the clinical trial. And we didn't know where to go. So you go to NIH, it's like, well, but right now there's really not anymore a priority of SARS. You go to BARDA, but yes, but we only really fund really advanced development, right? Post phase 2. So we were left in limbo, right? So that's kind of like that valley of death, kind of like, not necessarily valley of death of science failure or technical failure, is the financial failure. So then what we needed to do is, penny pinch the financial resources by calling Texas Children's and Baylor saying, can you give us some money from intramural sources to continue the program? Connecting with philanthropic foundations, can we get some money to go and do, additional stability studies? And so that penny pinching, hodgepodging of financial putting together. And we haven't even gotten to the point where we wanted to indeed enable, real life eventual clinical trials or even studies, right? So how do you can you elaborate more on, you're seeing it from the end backwards, I'm seeing it from the start to the end, and there's clearly a missing gap in between, that there's no continuity.
Yeah, I fully agree. And, when we think about the next pandemic, we have no reason to believe it will look anything different from what we've seen now, unless something dramatically changes in the way we are prepared. And some of the preparedness aspects have to do with the funding and the infrastructure that will be, if we want things to roll out differently, we will need to have a different infrastructure ready. And we don't know, we will never know when the next one will hit. But it will probably go through even a more accelerated path than we've seen this time. It took almost a year to get the first approved product. And then there was a really insane race to get the right, after you get the EUA, and to get some kind of real world assurance that this is working as well as one would expect in terms of effectiveness above and beyond the efficacy data. The same thing will happen in the next pandemic if it's an influenza pandemic, which is the most likely pathogen for us to see. And then we will probably see a product out quicker than we've seen in this case in COVID. And we will stand at the same point again. I don't know which platform it will be based on, the first vaccine that will be out in the market, but the same questions will arise at this point. Is this working as well as we predicted? Is this as safe as we would like it to be? And again, it comes to the point, will we have the systems in place in different parts of the world? Because again, there will be, we don't know where the differentially, both in terms of the number of infections that will be at the time. So where will be the hotspots where you can actually test the product? Because in the case of COVID-19, we could have had an amazing vaccine effectiveness assessment platform in Australia or New Zealand. It would have been completely useless because there has been almost zero cases. Mm-hmm. So if you're in the wrong time of the year, you might be in a totally different position where you are. And again, there will be some wave and some seasonality. So you need to have your basically your bets hedged on different parts of the world, and you need to have the right systems ready and set to work in near real time. And we don't have anything even remotely close to this at this time. We are. Even for seasonal influenza, our ability to assess vaccine effectiveness on an annual basis, it is, I would say mildly, it is far from being appropriate. We have so many unknowns in terms of what is the actual vaccine effectiveness for different age groups in different parts of the world on a yearly basis. The lag by which we get this data and our ability to draw practical conclusions to the policy making there's a big gap there. So I do think that I mean, this is not a US centric. This is more of a global view that we need to take, and we need to make some of these platforms able and ready. We can practice them on seasonal flu. So, as we always say, something that doesn't work on an annual basis will not work in emergency. You can't have a whole system just set up out of the blue. So we need to put them in place. We need to fund them. We need to make sure that we trust the data that we get from them on an annual basis. And then when the time will come, they will be able to give us the data that we need at the time that we need it.
You raise a good point with regards to seasonal flu when you relate to garnering the real life data, right? The real example data. But if we don't increase the coverage and use of the flu vaccine also more globally, I mean, there's clearly not so the US may have a good utilization and use of, flu vaccine, seasonal flu vaccine, but there's a lot of countries that, it's not even in their radar, right? So it's very hard to make like you said, really obtain real life data when we also haven't been able to really increase the utilization and coverage of a vaccine such as flu. I think we have examples, of course, with all the pediatric expanded immunization programs, and there's some regions that are better than others, but flu is a very unique case, right? Where we are certainly have these models of how much production you need, how much investments you need. You have the clinical trial, probably even networks. But there's still already a disconnect with how much of the actual flu vaccine is really using in real life to really determine, increase, like we heard in the prior panel, increasing the confidence, increasing the utilization, because knowing that data and having those results would also probably enable more confidence when you have a pandemic that is flu-related pandemic, that then people say, I'm used to getting flu vaccines all the time. If there's a pandemic and there's a new version or a new production platform that, of course, is accelerated for pandemic, we, of course, are able to, to accept it. So certainly financial investments also in not forgetting that we need to increase access, coverage, communication is also important. If I may, and Johanna, please interrupt me, because if not, we're going to go on back and forth without you saying a word. A question for you with regards to really the information systems and data. I think it's unprecedented that in this COVID-19, we have had so many clinical trials, right? With so many different multinationals, smaller vaccine manufacturers in all over the world, right? All over the world. But data is difficult to have open access and have access to that data when it's owned by, companies or is owned by just a very small groups. How can we really increase access and even data banks of information? Because I think we're losing a lot of probably very important immunological, like you said, real life experience, even just clinical data, because it's still quite protected, right? And I know it's a very difficult topic of how do you make information available when it's really owned by some groups, right? Which of course it's proprietary at some level.
So I think there's several different facets to this question. I think one is the issue of the infrastructure of data sharing. There's a lot of complexities associated with different regulatory mechanisms that are relevant in Europe, in the US, in Israel. They all have very different regulatory mechanisms. What is considered legit in one is not legal in others. And by having some kind of a common ground for data sharing that goes through the most, I would say, the highest level of both privacy and security that is considered appropriate for the various relevant involved countries would be a good basic infrastructure that would help for the specific aim of data sharing during an emergency, which again, we can always test drive during seasonal flu to see that actually data can flow in and out, and that all of the partners feel that they are safe and that it is used for the right purposes in the right way. So I think that's one way to look at it in terms of infrastructure. The other one is incentive, because again, many of these systems have to invest quite a lot in creating this data and curating the data. And this eventually needs to make sense for all of the entities involved. So by creating a grant-based system that is ongoingly available, and by having some kind of certainty by which once such an emergency is either occurs or there's a first signs of, then you toggle it on and people know what to expect and organizations know what to expect. And they can prepare for that point in time and prepare the data, prepare their mechanisms in order to be able to share data at that point. And you've mentioned COVID, and very rightly so. There were so many clinical trials run almost at once at unprecedented speeds and quality and level. But at the end of the day, these were several thousands of people involved. And these kind of numbers cannot truly give you a true measure, neither of, to some event, to effectiveness in subgroups, especially among the elderly, among the immune suppressed, among other populations at interest, which are critical for such an emergency, but also in terms of adverse events. I mean, as we see right now in several adverse events that can only be assessed in a large scale post emergency licensing procedure. And so we need to understand that in these events, we don't have the multiple years to do this, the gradual follow-up and a gradual increase. We will need to put these mechanisms in place in a way that was not done before. And I think that we should select the right places that are able to produce very rapid, near real-time streams of data. And we should compensate them in a way that would allow them to become the, I would say, the test ground of the world that will be able to provide real-world data in real time and share it in a way that others can use. And again, this we need to learn from our experience in COVID-19 and make this available. We've seen this happen haphazardly. I'm sure many other countries and many other entities could have chipped in if there was the right infrastructure in place.
These are all wonderful points. I feel like a very privileged student in a private classroom with experts getting, just wonderful knowledge. But I will ask a question to take the pressure off of Maria as well. That's kind of twofold here. We've been talking a lot about investments, and what can enable this continued kind of coordinated global research, whether that's in, the clinical trial networks or continued innovation in research and development of vaccines, knowing that there are common cross-cutting issues across all pandemics and epidemics. So I'm going to ask the hard question of, if you had to choose one area for investment, one or two areas for investment that really could make, long-term and lasting difference, what would you advise that being, especially knowing that you two come from the opposite ends, meeting in the middle? I'd be very interested to hear your take on that.
Sure, I will start. So I think for me, and we've seen this now when now we're hearing that even with so many companies and certainly pharmaceutical companies developing these vaccines, there's still a lack of manufacturing capacity, right? And there's clearly huge gaps regionally in Africa, Latin America. So I think one of the lines of sustainable funding that we will need is this ability of finding ways of how to teach technology, how do you technology transfer, right? And we're seeing it now. Everybody, of course, now wants to enable even more the RNA technology, right? But let's also not forget that we have to maintain the warm base of the conventional technologies in the backdrop of bringing new innovative technologies, right? So if you're going to bring in, how do you teach how to develop an RNA vaccine, and how do you scale an RNA vaccine for whatever disease eventually may be, including for flu? You also have to maintain the support of maybe other conventional platforms, because of course you're still producing other vaccines, right? So you're not gonna, I don't think it's gonna be very easy to totally replace. I think there's gonna be a point where there's have to be a balance between conventional and new innovative technologies, because there's still not a 100% agreement of a technology working for absolutely every disease, right, or every pathogen. So, we were very lucky RNA worked for COVID-19. Maybe doesn't work for flu, right? I mean, it doesn't, we don't know. So I think funding that ecosystem of the technology transfer is going to be very important, which is also going to increase self-sufficiency by other regions, right? Not relying only on high-income country producers, but also leverage even more the developing country vaccine manufacturing network, but expanding it to other regions of the world. So that's probably my, top one. And then second, it's in that context, ensure that the quality management system and the regulatory framework that, governs those technology transfer activities are also solidly funded. Because if you can have great production, but in a location that the regulatory framework doesn't exist or is not understandable. And when you bring novel technologies, the regulators have to understand that, they have to learn along the way while it's being produced and evaluated. So I'll send it to Ran now.
Okay, so I'll try to touch on other things that were not mentioned, some things that might be interesting. I think that if we focus for a second on influenza as the cause of the next pandemic, I think one of the areas that we should look at is to continue our effort on finding heterosubtypic solutions. There are different efforts that are trying to be strain-independent vaccines, passive immunization, and other efforts. I think that by understanding that we do not know what the next strain that will cause the next pandemic flu will be, but we know, again, it will be something that we don't necessarily know by now. I think that some of the efforts, none of the efforts until now to create a heterosubtypic proper vaccine that works have been successful, but I think it is definitely something that we should invest more efforts in. So that's point number one. The second point I think that's worthwhile investing is the issue of correlates of immunity. And we saw how difficult it was in this case to understand and to substantiate what can we trust. What can we trust in terms of humoral? What can we trust in terms of cellular correlates? And I am sure that with any vaccine of the future that we will need to understand for any pathogen of interest, the issue of what can we trust in terms of before we actually put this into the into the field and see what happens in terms of actual morbidity, which is always a tricky issue. What can we trust? I think that we need to pour more funding and more infrastructure on that domain. The next point that I wanted us to think about is the issue of, one of the things that was most difficult and still is for most countries is vaccine hesitancy. And we should invest in public messaging that utilizes the newest forms of I would say science that's associated with properly delivering messages. Behavioral economics have been very successfully used in many domains. Netflix uses it to sell us the new series, and every person sees a different message, so it would fit best. And Amazon uses it to sell us the next T-shirt that we're going to buy, and it's very effective. It's not what one size fits all. Now, why isn't it the case that public health will be able to utilize those most advanced and be able to tackle some of the hesitancy issues? And finally, there's the issue of fact-checking that throughout this event have slowly developed, so we can prevent the infodemic that was happening in parallel to the actual pandemic. And the problem of false and fake news and disinformation and misinformation took, I think, as many lives as did in some places some of the actual morbidity, and because people have refrained from doing the right thing. So I think that we should invest some efforts and funding right now in creating a better armament for the public health personnel to be able to withstand the infodemic war of the next event, whatever it will be. It will definitely be as fierce as this one, if not worse, for all of the right reasons. So these are, I think, some aspects that I will focus on.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. Just anticipating all of the issues. So we need everybody to listen to this. I think, one of the things that we have talked, and this is a great segue, that many of these breakouts and the workshop generally have talked about is equitable access and distribution of the vaccine, and how it is that we can, address the diversity that's needed for actually solving the problem. Pandemics will actually bring this forward because there is no way out without, equitable distribution of vaccine. What do you guys see in research and development and innovation around this, and perhaps what experience in your role can you bring to helping this become more that way, more equitable?
So from my perspective, and certainly it's what our vaccine center has always predicated upon, is we embrace innovation without forgetting conventionalism and maybe things that are proven and at some level even trusted, right? So if we use the example of COVID-19, where maybe at the very early on of the pandemic, when it was even not a pandemic, you started with, an outbreak, which maybe we all thought, oh, this we're going to be able to tackle same as we did the prior SARS or MERS, or maybe even at some level how we have dealt with Ebola. I think we never had that perception that is going to become such global, right? So therefore, at the beginning, there was a lot of push for very rapid, very innovative, new technologies, and a lot of the support in vaccine development. If you notice the ecosystem of the first tranche of vaccines that have been, fortunately now authorized for use, they really are primarily new, never licensed before type of vaccines. While fortunately behind the scenes, there's a group of us, not only our group, but many, that we still believe that we also needed to balance that portfolio with more conventional type of platforms. Because now we found the realization that, albeit the RNA vaccines and certainly the vector-based vaccines and, certainly the, whole inactivated vaccines, they all have pros and cons. We're seeing huge challenges in scalability, certainly cost, tech transfer challenges, where we could have potentially brought in more of these conventional, like, in our case, of course, I'm biased, subunit type of vaccines where, we already knew, anybody who can make a hepatitis B vaccine probably can adopt our technology, and very largely scalable, very easy, we're simple upstream, downstream processes with even relatively simple formulation sciences, right? And so I think at the beginning we were too skewed to innovation. We don't want it also to be too skewed into just, traditional. We have to find that balance. And I think that's where we need to not lose that memory, right? That we need to adapt the scenarios faster, but not skew the scenarios, just assuming that we're going to take care of it with maybe, of course, also non-pharmaceutical interventions. There's some countries that did really, really well with prioritizing NPIs and then relying on secondary, pharmaceutical interventions. And then there's countries that did really poorly in NPIs, and now they're relying primarily on the pharmaceutical interventions. And so we need to kind of balance it all.
Great points. And since we're talking about equity, one of the things that people, I think, less think about when we think about equitable distribution of vaccines is the problem of the logistics. So yes, there's a lot to talk about availability of the vaccines, but if you think about the fact that there's a vaccine that you need to have in a -80 environment up until the point it gets to the clinic, you basically negate vast majority of the world from taking part in that exercise. So something that seems trivial, such as what are the cold chain maintenance and logistics aspects, is very critical in determining the equitable distribution of the vaccines to all parts of the world. And so I think that some of our efforts on an ongoing basis, especially in these types of we need to think about all of the different steps alongside the way. So you did develop a vaccine and it has certain very fastidious requirements. Is how do you make sure that the right environment to maintain the cold chain and other logistical requirements can be met, and how can you make sure that more countries will be able to withstand that? So thinking that maybe some of the next products that will be available in the next pandemic would require similarly fastidious logistics chains, that might be something that you can invest in right now, both in terms of the actual freezers, but also in terms of the available centralized data on which vaccines got where and how much more do they need. And how can you turn them from big boxes to smaller boxes that can actually arrive to smaller areas that otherwise will not get them because there's not enough people there to fill a whole box of 100 vial, several of these vials altogether. So this is point number one. I think we should put more emphasis not just on the innovation in the manufacturing, but also to think about the mundane aspect of logistics that could really be determined. The second point that I want us to think about is the complementary of vaccines are the drugs. And I have to say that I originally thought that we will have an effective medication far before we will have an effective vaccine. If you would have asked me what were my expectations in February 2020, I would tell you, probably around June, we'll find the right molecule that would help us to tackle the most severe cases. And maybe a year later, we will have an effective vaccine that will be licensed and manufactured. And this is very far from what actually happened. And when you look about what our momentum do we have right now in terms of the medications for COVID-19, it's basically steroids and a little and extra change. So I think that is something we need to think about. How come that we couldn't do, the discovery processes to find out what actually works in terms of repurposing and other, we've been talking about drug repurposing for at least a decade. I think this is the event where it should have shown its beautiful outcomes, and it didn't. And it's either because we were in bad luck, because nothing works, or because that we don't have the mechanisms to sort out from the available data what actually works and what does not, and find out what does the trick and what does not. And I would add to that for too long during this crisis, there were, I would say, half facts, and people were using the wrong medications in different countries for a long time, which I think in some cases harmed patients, and in some cases just led to false hopes and spending of the scarce resources in terms of equity. That's actually the exactly wrong thing to do. The scarce resources that you have are going to the exactly wrong modalities. So we should learn something from this for the next crisis on how we can make sure that there's a trustworthy funnel for these medications and wonder medications in real time, And how can we make sure that every country gets the right information about what works? And when you have something that actually works, that it is also available. Just like we talk about vaccine availability, we should also talk about medication availability once you find out what actually works and what does not.
Thank you so much. I know that I've forced you all to be experts on all different parts of financing and investment when it comes to research and development, but and I understand that you both are busy folks with places to go. So I just want to allow these last minutes for final comments that either of you have in your areas of expertise on what is the lesson learned you would take from your experience with COVID and applying it to influenza.
Very important, right? Because this is the objective of these workshops, and certainly the big NASEM committee charges, right, that we have, which I'm privileged of actually participating in one of them. And indeed is this, I think, the balance between what I call, the warm base activities, right? That we are operating in. How do we better flu vaccines as well as, of course, therapeutics and flu interventions for seasonal activities? But how do you therefore prepare for when you actually have an emergency or a crisis, which is, of course, would be a pandemic flu? And I think, as we discussed also this morning, is as much as we saw a lot of efficiencies gained, a lot of course, collegiality, collaborations, partnerships, of course, a lot of money was added to the pot during this pandemic. It's not going to be sustainable to always do this reactionary approach, right? So we can't always wait until we have some crisis to all of a sudden everybody deploying the money, the partnerships, accelerating. I think at some level we did a really pretty amazing job already. Probably not the 100% perfect, but we've learned a lot. But this is just not sustainable. So we need to find a way where we continue doing what we call our work during peacetime, right? During non-crisis time, improving that, but with whether it's governance model, financial model, business model, scientific model, that we can rapidly pivot. And it also all starts with surveillance, right? To make sure that, where are we lacking a lot? Genomic surveillance, epidemiology surveillance, like you said, also, preparing the clinical trial sites, having the agreements for data sharing, right? So I think that's where we have to figure out a way. And in fact, flu potentially is a good model because we have a lot more lessons, a lot more years of working on this. And it may really even serve as a great framework to potentially then extrapolate and serve for other type of, viral type of infections or other type of infections. And thank you for the opportunity, Johanna, and sharing with Ran.
Thanks, Maria. Great points, and I would add maybe two more. One is the issue, if we need to ask what can we learn from COVID to the next one, is I think one is the issue of variants and scariants. In any future event that we will have, the issue of the mutations, drifts, shifts, would continuously be something that we will be very much involved in throughout the crisis, and definitely at the point of the exit strategies and vaccine-driven exit strategies. So we'll always have this event of when will we see the variant, the strain that would be vaccine circumventing the vaccine protective effects. And so what we see right now is the importance of the countries that have had an ongoing systematic surveillance of sequencing and continuous information on the different variants have actually helped us all in every other country in order to understand what we're standing up against. So I think this is something that every country needs to right now begin putting in place, a set of ready laboratories that are able to do this in real time and are able to provide a systematic sample of the whatever it is it will be, providing us with data and then sharing it in a way that others can and it's something that we can expand as needed with the right set of funding and expertise. The second point that I will mention is that we have developed some real world effectiveness assessment protocols during the COVID-19 that we've never used before. In our study at Clalit, the real world study that we've done, that we've compared 600,000 vaccinees to 600,000 unvaccinated people, and we did a very specific type of matching that we've never done before. So, we individually matched in a rolling real world assessment cohort every single person to its digital twin, if you'd like, that was same in every single way possible. Same neighborhood, same sex, same age, same chronic diseases in the background, same level of taking influenza vaccines in previous winters. So the ability to both computationally and also in terms of the data preparation process to get this data and to make this happen, and then with our friends at Harvard, Miguel Hernan and Mark Lipsitz and the team, to be able to do the right epidemiological processes that would overcome the basic biases associated with real world studies. I think that the lessons learned from being able to do a target trial emulation fully with retrospective data is something that we need to now know that is both possible but also very difficult. So we need to be ready when the next challenge will come. And it could be in this COVID-19 event, doesn't have to even to happen. The next variant comes in, a new adapted vaccine comes to play. And then the question comes again, how effective is it in the real world? How effective is it in chronically ill patients? How effective is it in the elderly population? How effective is it in immunosuppressed individuals? And with every single new variant and a new strain of concern or of interest. And so I think that putting a systematic way of continuously providing such data in a way that is trustworthy and is shown to be reproducible and similar enough to emulate a target trial is probably an important step forward that they should put in place.
Thank you. These are wonderful closing points. I appreciate the both of you taking time to be here, and these breakout discussions are generating bigger, broader ideas. So we've got a lot of them from the two of you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Johanna. Thank you, everyone.
Sure.
It's been a pleasure.